Hello everyone, I am Poonam Chaudhary from on behalf of Game Studies India, and today we have Marcus Toftedahl with us, and he is going to present a lovely paper on game localization. And welcome all of you. So good to see all of you here joining us on this Zoom call today. Here, Marcus, you can begin your presentation now. Oh wait, I should introduce you first. So, Marcus Toftedahl is a game researcher, developer, and lecturer at the University of Skövde, Sweden. His main competencies lies within game production, game localization, and game design from a practical and research perspective. Marcus has worked at the University of Skövde since 2009 and has since then co-developed the world's first full concentration game, writing education at writing education at university level, and is teaching game design and game production. His main research interests are within the game production field, where game development and game design are in focus. With his close connections to the with the local with his close connections to the local indie scene, the research conducted is focused on the practical issues and challenges of game development in small studios. Marcus has also a deep interest in serious games research and development, where he has led multiple game development projects as a part of the university's digital game research. Since summer of 2016, Marcus is focusing on his PhD project in socio-technical systems, researching the mechanisms behind being a local game developer in a global industry. The research aims to uh, the research aims to get a better understanding of the global games market from a developer perspective. As a part of his research, Marcus has done numerous study trips to game development studios in Asia and Scandinavia to get an understanding of current game development practices. So, hello, Marcus. So happy to see
Hello,
you here.
thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here talking to you, and I'm going to present some of my research that I've been doing for the last 4 years now. Let's see if I can share my screen. Now it is shared, I
Yeah,
hope.
yes.
Good. And I'm not sharing the presenter view. No, that's the
No.
classical Zoom dribbling with different screens and everything. Let's hope that this works now. I'm still screen sharing, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
Oh, good. So thank you for inviting me to this great initiative to have reoccurring game research talks on different topics. And thank you for the introduction as well, Poonam. I'm going to present maybe 3 or 4 papers in total combined into one presentation, but the overarching thing is game localization, and mainly from an independent developer's perspective, which is quite interesting because, well, the world, the game industry of today is a global industry, and if you're releasing a game, then you often do it worldwide from day one. I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment that we have here in Skövde, because it's quite important to get an understanding of why I'm doing this work. I'm I've been teaching game design the last 10 years on university level, also game production in general. And we have a comprehensive set of game development educations at the University of Skövde, with everything from programming to game design to game graphics, divided into both 3D and 2D and animation as well, sound and music, and the narrative aspects of games as well, with the game writing program that I don't think that we have seen any other game writing programs on university level so far. We also have master programs connecting to this with serious games and games and narrative, and also game production master program. And what is also interesting with our environment, that even though we're a very small university, Sweden's smallest in fact, and also a quite small city with only 50,000 inhabitants, we have a large community of indie game developers, former students at the university who after their education can start their companies. So these are some games from Skövde companies during the years. So quite many successful ones. One of the first, the really big success stories was Goat Simulator, developed by a company called Coffee Stain Studios. That was started some 10 years ago now by alumni students from the game development education. But also Stick Fight is quite popular, also started by a company started by former students. So we have this close connection to the local industry, well, by just by being here. And I mean, many of these students still are staying in Skövde, so we have built this community. The latest success is Valheim, where Iron Gate studio, super small studio of only 3 people from the beginning, got this massive success now, just recently with the Viking collaboration building game that is taking Steam by storm. And it's very interesting to follow these. Well, students first, but then developers, and many of them also give back to our educations by doing guest lectures or well, you get a good connection with the industry from the start. And of course, we also have a research part of it. So we are currently building our game lab and branding it more in line with the Sweden Game Arena, which is both the university and the incubator. But we have been doing game research for quite some time now, mainly focusing on serious games from the beginning, but now also taking more and more interest in the game development practices, that just to be able to build a better education and to build a better environment to be in here in Skövde. The research I'm going to talk about today is a part of a project called Game Hub Scandinavia, where I am doing my PhD project right now, focusing on Asian markets from a Scandinavian perspective. So that is the main. Somebody is not muted. Could you mute everyone, please? Is that possible, Suvik or Punam? Much better. Yes, and I have been focusing on the localization aspects of game production, because that's an area where, well, more research is needed, which is something that is one of my conclusions from my ongoing PhD research, but also because the indie scene is growing. Then you have, well, left the publishing function behind, and the developers needs to take care of more and more tasks as a part of being a game developer today. So this I have been focusing on for the last 4 years or so. I will be presenting my PhD this fall, hopefully. And this presentation is based on a number of papers that I have published previously. The first 4 are published. The last 2 here is in production and will be published soon, hopefully. So if you are interested in knowing more about, well, behind the scenes of the things that I'm talking about today, you can read this. I will give these links. I will provide them in the Facebook group later, so you can check them out if you're interested. Or of course, also contact me, and I will be happy to send them over. And they are focused on localization more or less. Some of them are, well, have localization as its core, but since the domain is game development, you often need to take detours to be able to find the things that you are looking for, right? So the main research question that I've been working towards is, how do indie game developers using a self-publishing business model work with game localization? And yeah, these papers that I talked about are one of the foundation of this presentation, but also the field studies that I've been doing, mainly 3 field studies, one from China, from a company in Shanghai called Shine Zone, where I spent 1 month to try to understand how Chinese developers work with, well, everything. And also a Swedish company called Guru Games, where I localized their game Medusa's Labyrinth into the Chinese market, so I could get the first-hand experience on actually doing some localization work. And also an Indian team. I hope that you have played this game, Missing. It's by Flying Robot Studios, which a project that I could follow for, well, maybe a year more or less. Unfortunately, not on site in India, but I participated through Skype meetings and so to get an insight in their endeavors in localizing the game into, well, actually the local market, which was also very interesting and a very interesting perspective. So today I will talk about, well, the purpose of localization. Why is this interesting at all? And what is it? And also the problem. I mean, well, how hard could it be, right? So what is the challenges, or what are the challenges of game localization? And more specific, what are the challenges of indie game localization? Because that is the core of this here. And as I will tell you later, there is a way of doing localization if you have the manpower or the resources to do it. Then it's not a very big problem. But if it is with limited resources, then it gets much harder. And also, how is it done now, and how should it be done? Or is it possible to have a model of doing indie game localization? So well, I have that overarching research question in the back of your heads during the presentation, because that is what it is all about. I will pick up on it some times during the presentation as well, but that is the core of it. So this is what it's all about, the localization process. And of course, when you present a model of it, it always seems super simple and logical. This is a process, the global product development cycle. And this model is derived from the practices that was starting in the end of the 1970s, when big companies like Microsoft and Lotus and other, Oracle maybe, started to develop office programs like word processors and spreadsheet programs for the global market. So even though they were US based companies, they soon saw that, oh, this could be sold to the whole world. And when they did that, they also realized that, not everybody is speaking English, or not all countries use US dollars as currencies. So they started to look into what kind of things do we need to alter when we release our product in some other region or some other country. So this is the origin of the software localization, upon which game localization to a large degree is based on, both for good and for bad, because while there is a process that we can start with, but it's not entirely compatible with games, because yeah, sure, games are software, but there are also a media product, and they have, yeah, you know, the whole discussion about what games are at its core. Um, and localization is often divided into three categories that you need to tackle, challenges or issues in this case. And the most obvious is the linguistic issues, where you need to translate the text or the speech or the language in the product to another market. But also other stuff than language needs to be changed, and it could be content and cultural issues, which is more undefined, but it is everything else than language. It could be how you perceive different icons or graphics or colors, or stuff that you need to alter in order to make the product work in another region. But also, of course, the technical issues behind this, and it could be the infrastructure needed to actually produce the localization, but also different kind of technical things in the different countries that you need to take into account. And an ideal process of this is to plan for it in the beginning, during the first phase, the internationalization phase, where you prepare the product to go through a second localization phase, where you do all these kind of alterations. You start to plan for it. You make your game or your software to have support for changing languages and so, and then you send your language files to a translator somewhere, and they give you it back, and you can import it into your product again to get a localized product, so to say. So that is the ideal product, and that is not always the case. That it is like this, and as I said, this is based on big corporations with almost unlimited resources. Uh, because it is, I mean, you often know your local market, and if we're talking about indie game developers, at least from a Skövde or a Swedish perspective, and especially if you look at small startup studios, then they often produce games for a target audience that they envision are more or less the same as they are. I mean, they think that, well, they speak English and they have the same interest, and they well are more or less the same that you are. But if you look at the game industry, it is a global industry, and well, games can get widespread, and then you have a different perspective. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand how the Chinese game market work, for instance, from a Swedish perspective. I mean, what do we know? What do we need to know about the Chinese game market in order to have a game developed in Sweden by a small company released in China? And then you have a totally different perspective. So, I mean, from the obvious thing that I talked about earlier is language. But in China, I would say that language would be the easy part. It would more be about the cultural issues and the technical issues as well. Uh, and this is a prime example of technical issues in different regions, because in Sweden and Europe, maybe India too, you're used to use certain infrastructure, so to say. You can use Apple iTunes or Google Play or Steam to access your games. In China, the market looks totally different. The things that we are used to and that we have learned to use here is not even available in China. They have a totally different ecosystem, and often one of the really big companies are behind this, like Tencent or Alipay, which has a large portion of the infrastructure in their hands. And well, that is one of the hurdles, of course. But then you also have the the cultural and the cultural issues. Let's see, my animations here doesn't work. Huh. Yeah. But the the thing was that you also have a very strict control from the Chinese government, for instance, where you have strict regulations on what you are allowed to produce and market in China. If you want to be if you want to have an official presence in China, for instance, then you need to have a local partner. So even though the Chinese wall is not used anymore for guarding the borders of China, well, there is still a very strict Chinese wall in terms of, well, both a functional firewall that actually keeps most of these services out, but also that keeps a strict control from the government. There is one exception that is quite interesting, and that is Steam. Steam is not available in China officially, but you can access it. You can access the game store. The prices are in the local currencies, both in mainland China and in Hong Kong. But you cannot access any of the community features like the forums or the review sections of games, but you can access the games themselves. And it's not actively blocked, but it's also not totally legal to use that kind of back way inside the Chinese market. But it's also showing that it is a very huge part of the Steam users that are from China. These numbers are some years old, but it was I took them when something happened in September of 2017, when suddenly there was a spike of Chinese Steam users where they surpassed, well, every other language group. And this is based on the official statistics from Valve's Steam pages. So over 60% of the users were using Steam in Chinese suddenly in December 2017. So it's it also shows that there is a huge demand of games of different kind. Now, this was not any game; it was PUBG, which made this totally bizarre race of Chinese Steam users. Now it is much more balanced, but still, Chinese users are a big part of the Steam users in the world. With now these numbers were from yesterday, so almost 19% using Steam in Chinese. And of course, this doesn't say anything. I mean, Swedish, it doesn't say everything. Swedish is just 0.4% of the user, but I guess we have a fairly large install base here in Sweden as well. But most of the people here may be using the English version of Steam. So, but it gives some kind of indication that well, things are happening, even if in the case of Steam, if it is not available in China officially, it can be accessed, and people want to access these kind of games anyway. So challenges for China is, of course, the linguistic one. I put Chinese in brackets there because, I mean, there is a multitude of languages in Chinese, where simplified Chinese or Mandarin is the largest. But if you want to look into the Chinese market, then the cultural and content issues is the really big challenge or problem, where you need to have a local partner or a publisher if you want to have an official presence in China.
Hi, Marcus. I would have to
Hello?
interrupt. Yeah, this is Poonam. I would have to interrupt all of us because we need to leave this meeting, and everybody can join the meeting with the same link. It's a recurring meeting, so we have run out of time basically, so we have to get to another
All
meeting.
right.
Yeah, please,
Okay.
everybody join the same link, and we will see you in
Hi,
another.
hi, Marcus. This is Shovik.
Hi,
This is
Sovik.
what happened. We are hi. we are a poor community of game
I
scholars, so we get
see.
thrown
Yeah,
out
yeah,
each
yeah.
time. So please feel free to carry on for as long as possible you want, because we'll just go into the same meeting again. So I'll
Yeah,
request
sure.
everybody to log back in.
Yes.
See you soon then.
See you soon. Are we?
Yeah, my
Are
computer
we?
is acting a little strange. Yeah.
Okay, no worries.
Hindi or Bangla. Uh, me as a developer, I would have no idea what the translation said. So I have to have faith in the people who are doing the translation as well, because there are a lot of well subpar translation services out there, and so there is also a difficulty there where you hand over a bunch of text strings, and then you receive something that you have no idea of if it's, well, good or bad, or uh, somewhere in between. And that is also a part of the interesting domain with working with indie game studios, because often when we talk about game developer, and we do it as well at the University of Skövde, when we talk about game development, well, then you need to have a game designer, a programmer, a writer, need to have some graphics artist, and you need to have somebody doing the sound and music, and then they are working together to make a game, and that is fine. I mean, that is one part of the production, which is of course important. But then when you have the game and you want to have it, well, accessible to somebody else, somebody outside the development team, then there is a lot of challenges where especially if you have limited resources, where you will have to work, well, smart, and maybe do some more research in order to succeed. So this is a distribution chain where it's originally from Egenfeld Nielsen, and then it's modified by O'Hagan to incorporate also a game localizer function. And this is based on, I mean, the AAA or the big company business models, right? Where you have a hardware manufacturer who is in contact with the game developer, who in turn is in contact with the publisher, and then the publisher have contact with the distributor in order to distribute the physical copies to retailers, and then in the end, the game is reaching the consumer. And somewhere in this chain, you have also a game localizer working together with the publisher, the game developer, and also to some extent the hardware manufacturer in this model. But what is interesting when we look at the digital distribution, which where we have the majority of at least indie games sales today, well, a lot of these functions are not existing or are not valid anymore. So this is a comparison between value chains proposed by the European Game Developer Federation. It is some years old, but it's still it shows the evolution or the transition from a retail-driven value chain to an online value chain, where well all these both the developer and publisher and distributors and retailers before you end up with your game in the hands of the consumers and then you have what they calling the mobile driven value chain, where the developer is in direct contact with a distributor, often an app store or a digital game store like Google Play or Steam or whatever, which in turn have contact with the consumers. Or the online value chain, which they are calling it also, where the developer is in direct contact with the consumers. This model is maybe not very common anymore. You often have a middle distributor of some sort. Even if you have like flash games on a website, they are often gathered in one place. But still, the publisher is nowhere to be found here, or the retailers. And I mean, the publisher handled a lot of these tasks where localization is one part of it. So I was a little bit curious of, okay, what kind of roles do we actually have when producing a game? So I looked at the end credit sequence from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, when this game was new some years ago, and made and looked at, okay, what kind of roles do we have? And first and foremost, it was tens and thousands of people involved if it covered, when it covered all the, the both from corporate to the developers. So several thousand people involved in making these big triple A games. But it was also interesting to see that in the middle here you have tester. It's one of the biggest, and we have translation and localization, also quite frequent. Support, quality control. And of course, a lot of the people working with games are the traditional games or programmers. So if you want to secure a job in in game development, well, programming is the way to go. So this is the word cloud in numbers, so to say. So tester was the most frequent, 415 occurrences, but also localization and translation. Quite many people were working with this. So even though it's maybe not considered as a game development task, it becomes a game development task when you need to do it. So I have modified this value chain. So this is my proposal as it is now, and I think I will need to iterate on it more. But I mean, a lot of the functions. So even if the publishing function disappears, the work task still needs to be done. And who is going to do that? Well, the game developers. They take the role of being both a publisher and game localizer. And then we also have a very important aspect of development today. When you have this direct contact, when you cut out all the middlemen and you have the contact with the consumer directly, somebody needs to do that as well. And the role of the community manager is also something that needs more research on how that function is. And the localization function, well, the game developers in collaboration with translators is what I found through my research. And this paper is dug a little bit deeper into this. It's called Game Localization from an Indie Perspective: Why, When, and How. And I did some interviews with developers in China, Sweden, and India. Not only the ones that I did field studies at, but also to just to see, okay, who is doing the localization in your game. You have a game that is released, you have players over the world. Who is doing the localization? How are you handling that? And the translation is very often handled by fans, the players of the game, asking to get the game in their local language. Like if you have a player from Poland and you don't have the game in Polish, then in several cases they told about that the players reached out to them to say, okay, I can translate the game into Polish for you if you want. I don't want any money for it. I just want to play it, be able to play it in Polish. But also using freelance translators, and I've put that into quotation marks because one frequently used service was the Fiverr service, where you can get freelancers into doing whatever you want, more or less, and translation is one task that is common there. You can pay somebody to do a translation into any language and you get it back. I will get back to that later, but that was an often used service, so to say. But from a developer perspective, well, the developers who had the time were involved in localization work. Game writers and narrative designers were, well, maybe a natural choice, but not all teams have that function. But also sound designers, people who, unlike programmers, are not uh, are not well, I don't know how to put this delicately, but are not needed at all times, so to say, as well as studio managers or CEOs. Somebody needs to handle it, even if you have a translation handed over to you. So this is what one of the game developers in Sweden said, that our players are translating the game completely. We do not use any third-party companies, and we made a social media post about that. We want to translate the game because during the early access phase, some of the players gave feedback saying that they wanted it in their native language. And then they wrote to them and told, okay, come and help us. And then they got a lot of people to help them out. And they set up a system with a Google spreadsheet document where they have the original text in English, and then you could fill in the spreadsheet. So a very simple approach, but community-driven one. And often when when the community is involved, they also correct themselves. If somebody do a subpart translation, then somebody comes in and corrects this. So this is about the Fiverr service, also Swedish developer we're talking about. We are using freelance translators, and then I have been managing that. Implementation and contacting and finding translation and such. So this developer put in a lot of work with managing the contacts with the translators from this Fiverr service, and we have found all translators through the Fiverr service. And then some months later, I met this developer again, and then he told me that well, you remember what I said in the interview, that Fiverr is working great. You get a lot of words for little money. Well, it turned out it was not that great, actually, because it was more or less only Google translated text that we got. And we paid, well, maybe not much money, but a little money for something that we could have got for free. And now we put a lot of time and effort into managing it. So even though it seems like, okay, somebody is helping us here and knows this, well, maybe it is not that high quality that you want to have. So how should it be done then? Well, and I mean, this is easy as a researcher to say that, oh, this is the way you should be doing it. But when you are doing game development on a small scale with limited resources, that, well, then you really have to prioritize. But with this work, I also hope that some of at least our future students get the ability or the get the possibility to plan ahead a little bit and to actually realize the importance of having this localization friendly development setting, as it is called, where you can plan for it. And you can have also tool support for it in common game engines like Unreal Engine or Unity or Game Maker or whatever you are using, that you still need to have tools that support localization to have this. And I've put planning 2 times because it is very important. But to have a good connection with the tools that you use, the game engines, and also the overall production pipeline. And so a colleague wrote a paper on game engines just to see, okay, what kind of which are the most popular game engines used in the indie game development scene. And I took it one step further to look into, do they have built-in support for localization? And some of them had, some of them had not. But this is our overarching model of a game development pipeline, where you have a game engine that could be Unreal Engine, it could be Unity, it could be something that you have developed for yourself, where you have a core engine, which is the core of the game engine, running all the intricate parts, highly optimized. You have physics, input, output, graphics driver, and everything in the core. But then you have a number of tools that could be either user facing, and that is while they are facing the user, you can create stuff with the user facing tool, or you can have a tool facing tool, which acts as like an importer of such. If you need to convert 3D models into a format then that the game engine can understand, then you're using a tool facing tool. Quick overview of our idea of different kind of tools. I will come back to this later. But we also looked into what kind of support the most popular game engines had for localization. And we looked at Construct, CryEngine, Game Maker, Godot, Unity, and Unreal Engine. And the choice was made of, we looked into the games released on Steam and the indie storefront itch.io, which games published there used which game engines they used, and these were the most common. So in the latest paper that I wrote, not published yet, hopefully will be soon, I looked into what kind of tool support for localization tool support do these engines have. And a game engine like Construct, for instance, a 2D game engine, while the documentation do not address localization, and it does not have a localization tool, but you can add additional tools by an official tool library. For Unity, for example, which is the most famous tool library, the Unity Asset Store, you had a multitude of different options when choosing your technical infrastructure for building your game. But it was also interesting to see that Unity had no mentions of localization in the official documentation, and no localization tool included in the game engine from start. Unreal Engine was the only one that had, no, also Godot, the open source engine, where you had documentation addressing localization as a part of the development, and also an official localization tool included, and the possibility to add more functionality by adding more tools. But the planning part is important, and that was also something that I found when interviewing the developers. This is a Swedish developer again. We did not plan for localization at all when we started. It started as a student project, and we thought naively enough that most people know English and that our target audience is probably mostly in America and Northern Europe anyway. But then we came so far that we started to engage in publishing negotiations, and there was a demand from the publisher side. So there you have the publisher functions as well, where they, okay, if you're going global, then you need to have a localization support. So then they needed to add localization support to the game retrospectively, which was a huge undertaking because, well, you needed to add this kind of functionality into the game after it was released. If you had planned for it before, if you had known about it, then you could plan for it before, and it would be much less of a problem, because if you do it from the start, then it's actually not a very big deal. So this is an example of a localization kit that I worked with in the Swedish development case, the Guru Games case. So I created this localization kit, as it is called, where you have all the text in the game. This is example is from the menu system. The in-game pause menu and the graphics quality and everything also. And then I sent that to translators in China and got back this. And then, okay, is this good or is it bad? I don't know, but I have no choice because we need to have Chinese text into the game. And this is the also an example of a localization kit. It is from Missing, where all the dialogue is in text here, and then you put it in other language, and it would be the same thing. That well, if I would localize into Hindi or Bangla, I would not know if the results are good or bad. But the planning is something that you can do anyway. I mean, that is a problem further down in the pipeline, the translation quality. So even though the translation part is not as interesting for me as a game researcher, it is an important part for the developer. So this would be my suggestion for a localization friendly production pipeline, where you have a translation management system that the translator is using to create this localization kit. Then you have a tool-facing tool that converts the data from this translation management system. You have a localization kit importer, which in turn talk to the game engine, the localization system there. And this, I would imagine, would be better if it would be both user-facing and tool-facing. So you could make alterations to some minor things in the game engine itself. So you don't need to start from the beginning each time. Could also import back. So when in the development process does the localization work occur? And what I found is it is often too late, especially if you are an experienced developer or you have to prioritize really hard. Then this is you're focusing on making a functional game first. And well, I understand that. It's not that strange, but it can hit back later. But we also have quite weak support in the most common general purpose game engines like Unity or GameMaker for localization. So you need to do some kind of custom made solutions anyway. And even by reading up on in the official documentation of these game development tools, you won't come across game localization. So often you find it out when the players tell you that, oh, we want it in your game in this language, which could be a good problem if you see what I mean, because then it shows that you have reached players somewhere at least. And even if game engines do have localization support, it is very difficult sometimes to have languages that doesn't use the Latin alphabet, for instance, like Arabic or Hindi or whatever. It is, well, subpar would be a nice way of putting it. If I would say that the support is subpar for this, it's even worse. It's much more complicated to have even big languages like Arabic, where you read from right to left. technical support is really bad in these cases, which is also a big problem, of course. So how to come back to how it should be done, which was when what we started with, the big company way of doing it for word processors. Well, it's still valid. I mean, it is a model that you should plan for it. You should have an internationalization phase where you design for having support for localization, where you can take into account the linguistic issues, the content and cultural issues, and the technical issues. And then it would be much simpler to do it. And so how do indie game developers using a self-publishing business model work with game localization? Well, often backwards. They start with localization somewhere when they need to, and then they just do the localization and maybe adding the support later to make quick fixes. But that is also the nature of doing well, small scale and small resource projects that you need to adapt to the current reality, which is but I hope that with my research I can at least raise some questions and point to the planning aspect of it, that if you have it somewhere in the back of your head, maybe you decide to add support for a proper internationalization phase. So some conclusions, well, plan for it, and also to assign at least some resources to localization. You need to handle it somewhere, and then I think it would be wise to have even planning on the individual level to have time for it, because it is more expensive and more difficult to do the internationalization phase, to add the support for localization late in the development process or even after release. So ja, tack för att ni har lyssnat. Det var kul att få prata för er. So thank you so much, and thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, you can.
Thank you for the localized ending to the.
Yes, wasn't that nice, huh?
Perfect.
Yeah.
So the farewell. We're open to questions. Over to Poonam to kind of ask.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for this great talk on game localization. It was very insightful. It was a much needed talk that we really needed to discuss in our community. And I'm so happy that you mentioned the game missing. So I for one came across the game only during the games and literary conference that was held in Kolkata by Shovik's University. Back then, that was Shovik's University. So that's when I came across the game, and it was I'm so happy that I got to. So it was a good lot of memories. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very interesting game on so many levels, and I mean the paper that I wrote on it, I started to do it as a localization paper, but then I found that it's not the core of this anyway. I wanted to see how players reacted to the kind of heavy subject that it is tackling, and if you could, as a developer, just use the automated tools that is provided through the Google Play Store to use that. And then I also got an interesting localization part of it as well, where luckily enough the game became very big in Bangladesh. I think it was topping the charts there during at least a couple of weeks as the most downloaded game, and that's quite interesting. Yeah, just because
I think Shobhik Mukherjee was involved in that process. I think a little bit.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. In the Bangla localization process.
Yes. Yeah. a while ago. So I was actually part of the little group which sat down and looked at the Google Play Store stats, and then started kind of deciding on kind of where to localize for. And of course, Bangladesh is an obvious option. So some of that dialogue is also stuff that I've kind of just briefly, talked about the developers at that time. Yeah. So.
But then they knew that they had high quality localization.
Uh, well, thank you so much. That is very kind. But they actually, because the localization happens because Bangla is the language which is used in West Bengal anyway, and it was made for West Bengal, not particularly for Bangladesh, not particularly a different dialect of Bangla, but it just worked very well. But it's quite strange that some games that were made in Bangladesh, like Heroes of 71, have not really kind of topped the Bengal, the game market in this particular part of India, but that's a different issue. But I had a question. Can I ask that, Poonam? It's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
slightly
absolutely. This is our Q&A session, and please, everybody, feel free to ask any questions you have. You can either post them in the chat box, or you could unmute yourselves and ask any questions you have.
yeah. So if anybody wants to go ahead before because I always ask questions, so that would be really great. Otherwise, I will ask my
Yeah.
question. But
Also, another thing, we may run out of time again, so we have to leave this meeting, and we would have to go to the next meeting with the same link. We have the same link. So should we end the meeting now and join in the new meeting, or should we
I
stick
suppose
here?
I can just ask my question quickly and
All
see
right,
if there aren't any
all right,
more. Then,
all right.
my question is very quick, Marcus. It was influenced by one of your students at Toftedahl, and it is about culture and localization. When you're talking about a language, but what about culture? Uh,
Yeah.
and how does that translate? And he's actually a Turkish student. You might know him, and he was asking about how the Middle East was translating in Assassin's Creed, particularly culturally. This is my question, really. How does culture kind of work?
Yeah, and that is a super interesting question, and I know that you have been talking about that too, Suvik, with different. I mean the names in Street Fighter, for instance, with and such. But
Yes.
one aspect that I have been interested in that I will at least, I don't know, I hope that I can address it in some way is the difference in if there are cultural differences in what kind of game mechanics or what kind of game design that different cultures are interested in, if you can generalize it like that. And that because, as I said in the beginning, game localization has its roots in software localization and media localization, like just subtitling. But then we also have the interactive part where you have different kind of game mechanics. And I mean, we have seen some of the game mechanics that were popular in Korea early on, for instance, with have been really successful in other regions too, and also monetization aspects like the free to play things starting in Asia, having a hard time in the beginning, especially in Northern Europe, where this was really frowned upon from a developer perspective, but then gained acceptance. So the cultural aspect of game localization is super interesting. I don't have any good answers, but that is an area that really needs to look into and from a game perspective as well, because I have the feeling that it's not the same as with software or other media.
So that's a very interesting comment, Marcus, when you said not the same as with software or other media. And I was about to ask you about localizations of TikTok or Facebook and other, but we have another question, and I would request maybe it's a good idea to shift to the next meeting
Yeah.
because
Okay.
our time
Yeah.
is ending here. So let's move to the next meeting. I'm sure there are more questions on our way. Oh, there are quite a few. So if all of you could please kind of hold on to your questions and ask them at the next Zoom meeting.
Yes,
Then
it's the
we
same
could share.
link, and yeah,
Link.
See you soon.
we'll see you there.
See you there.
I would love to ask a question, if I may.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm also happy. I think it was Sarah who posted that she's really happy that we're moving to the cultural localization now, because yes, this is also something which interests me. And in a way, I have to say, though, I was also super glad to hear missing mentioned. I'm not convinced that we are talking about localization at all here, unless you have the definition that it really includes the sheer language translation. So as in the case of Missing, as in some other games, we do have the text only. We don't even have audio when it comes to the language. So for me, honestly, this would be translation. Localization, I personally would understand to at least include some cultural components. And what I found super interesting, just as Shuvik said, that it can even translate to the rule system. But we are talking like super general by now. Could you just give, and possibly for the Indian context, not for the Chinese, could you give us an example, 2, 3 examples? That would super interest me, and it seems not only me.
You mean examples of localization?
Cultural localization.
Cultural localizations, yes. Yeah, and and it is difficult. And I mean, it's also a mix of terminology, which I find highly confusing. I mean, we're talking about localization, but we're also talking about translation, just as you say, and that has been one of my biggest problem, maybe, to really find out where the line goes, so to say, because when you look at it from the development perspective, then localization is often equal to translation of language, unfortunately. But as you say, if there are examples of truly localized games, sure, there are, and often they are in the, I mean, there is also examples of whole genres, like the Japanese RPG genre, that is a very a genre that was first inspired by the Western RPG role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons with the rule systems and so. And then when both Square and Enix, which is now the same company, did their Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, they used some of the rule systems from Dungeons and Dragons to create the first Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, which in turn again then was exported back to well, the US mainly, to be even more adapted into, well, more like an action RPG genre maybe. So but there, this as you say, it really it's not only about language, it's also about the different the other aspects of it. But when looking from a development perspective, unfortunately, it often is about the language, and not as much as I would hope the cultural things, because I don't know if I can give you a good example of a good cultural localization, a game that is well culturally
You mentioned the rule
local.
system. You yourself mentioned the rule system, and that would be super interesting. Do you
Yeah,
have any
it would be
where it actually like goes down to that level in a game?
And that is something that I really would like to look into deeper, that kind of aspect. Okay, how do we what kind of differences are there? and that is something that is very that is rarely mentioned when you talk about game localization, about I mean just game mechanics, or it's something that needs to be taken looked at from a game perspective, because now it's so influenced by localization studies, which has its roots in both translation studies and also software localization, and this still shows. So what I'm trying to do is to turn it around and to look at it from a game perspective, and hopefully that the next step will be to look in more into the cultural aspect, because there we have some really interesting stuff. We have some questions in the chat here,
yes.
I see.
Yeah, we do. So I think we have a role of skins in localization. And what's your opinion regarding making a particular set of skins free for that localized area and its impact on game development and sales? Interesting.
Yeah, I have no opinion. I think it sounds like a really interesting take on localization. I mean, I guess it would be like, okay, in this region you would get this look of the character included when you're buying the game. I don't know. Is it something that is it a common practice? Do we have any examples of this? I think it sounds like an excellent idea to profile your game in a specific region.
Yeah.
That would be my opinion.
Dovahkiin, if I'm saying the name right, do you want to say something? Maybe not. All right, maybe we can move on to the next question from Akansha Goswami. She says, AI translation tools are not very successful in literary works. Do you think that AI translation tools will have an important place in the game industry?
No. not not now, at least. I think yeah, to some extent, of course, it could be a good help to, like Sarah is also mentioning the in the comment above there with the pitfalls of from a game dev workflow. Maybe it could be of help of identifying something, but it's still in the area where, I mean, you're doing something into something that is unknown for you. Then maybe it could be, I mean, you could use Google Translate, for instance, to get an ID if the text that you receive is in the same ballpark at least, but not more than that. So yeah, right now, no, it's not very useful. It's not in translation, at least. Maybe for some other aspects, but I don't know. But AI will it will have a bigger impact on game development on a from a broader perspective. That's for sure. But I cannot say anything about localization in particular in that aspect.
I have a strange question. Do games really need to be localized? Do all games need to be localized?
That's a very good question, actually. And I mean, you can have, I mean, in the very beginning of the game industry, like in early 80s, and so when the games became more commercial, Mia Consalvo has been writing has written a book called From Atari to Zelda, about the Japanese, when Japanese games traveled to the US. Then the games were not perceived as Japanese games as such, but more like well, new and interesting experiences. And but then the games were also much simpler, more like the arcade games, like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. So not all games need to be localized.
Yeah, because we had a talk from, I think he's here, from Samya Brata Roy, Shama Brata Roy, as we say in Bangla. He presented a paper on Hitman 2, and there's a Mumbai mission there, and his paper was on how badly the game had localized
Yeah,
India in
sure.
that particular
Yeah,
mission.
yeah.
Shamu, are you here? Do you want to explain more? I don't think he is here.
No.
But yeah.
No, but that from that angle, it is another question. Yeah.
Also, I was also thinking, do all games need to be localized or translated for that matter? Because I told you, I think in the beginning of the video call that I've recently started playing Disco Elysium, and they posted that their final cut is out, and a lot of people were angry in the comments that the game hasn't come out in Turkish yet. Release the game in Turkish, and I was wondering, I mean, yeah, I mean it's I don't know. Do all games need to be localized? Do all games need to be translated? Yeah.
Yeah. No. No.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't
I
know.
think it's from case to case. I mean,
It has to be, yeah.
sometimes it's a business decision. Sometimes it's a decision of some other sorts, and I think it's hard to generalize.
Yeah, it also happens when you translate Japanese games, right? I mean, usually the translation is so bad. I'm only talking about translation. I don't have much idea about the rest, but sometimes when they do, the language is so off. So maybe it's a purely an industrial decision, perhaps. They just want to make profit, I guess. So they just want to translate and expand the horizons of the game. I don't know. Once there are a lot of questions in the chat. Yeah, let's get back to that. So Peach is saying, in my opinion, making skins available to a certain country or area is more about looking at data and making decisions based on trends rather than localizing content. Skins are often expensive from a development standpoint, and making the decision to give them for free should be driven by looking at data.
Yeah, sure. A business decision. Yeah, and your comment was just an observation, not a question. Yeah.
And Rico and Shobhit Mukherjee are talking about GTA, Vice City, Bengali, and Punjab. Yeah, we have our own GTA, Bengali, and Punjab. And from Anubhav Anand, we have, on the other hand, giving a particular set of skins for free can show appreciation for culture and can help the developers increase the sales as well as make loyal customers. Interesting.
Yeah, and still it often boils down to business decisions, and even though the missing case was merely translation, and I totally agree there, it's also, I think it will, since it is, games often are how to put this, I have some thoughts about this somewhere in my head, but it feels like since many of the big games of today are free to play in some cases, it's quite available, actually, many of them. Of course, you have with the different kinds of microtransactions and so, which well, that's another debate, but still, from an entry level, it would be interesting to see. No, I lost it. It is something there. Sorry.
It's okay, it'll come to you later.
Mm,
Shovik is talking about our WhatsApp. So we are very active on our WhatsApp group. We have a WhatsApp group for Game Studies India Adda, where we talk about video games, we post memes about video games, we post about the events that are happening. So in case any of you want to be a part of the conversation or discussions, please join the group and we will see you there. In case if you in case you're not on WhatsApp or don't want to be a part of it, we have a Facebook page and you can stay up to date with all the events and all. We post everything there. And including this talk, we will post the recording there and we'll post the recording on on our YouTube channel as well.
super. Thank you for
I think
hosting
there are
this.
no more questions.
No, that's perfect. I need to leave now anyway, so.
All right. It was a great talk. Thank you so much, Marcus.
Thank you. Hope to see you again in the future.
Yes. All
Bye.
right. Bye, everyone.